Video, as you can tell, we're going to be talking about mummification and all things related to mummies and how they were successfully mummified in ancient Egypt. So, before we move away from the cartoon, um, just a couple of things to kind of keep in mind, right? So, we've already talked about the Egyptian Book of the Dead and their belief in the afterlife. But before we could read hieroglyphics or anything, we knew a fair amount about Egyptian afterlife, mostly because of the practice of mummification. We know that if a society is going to go through all of the effort and expend all the resources that are necessary to mummify a body, that it must be important, right? That there must be a reason for that. Think about the building of the pyramids, right? Like that those were built for a burial tomb. Obviously, that must have been an important person or done in a way that was important to Egyptian society. Otherwise, people wouldn't have devoted their lives to that practice. And the same is true with mummification. There were priests, specifically priests to Anubis, who devoted their lives to perfecting the art of mummification. And ancient Egyptians mummified pretty much anything, pets, animals they found, animals that they wanted to offer to the gods in the afterlife, right? There was just, if it was alive, it could be mummified. Everything from cats to hawks to crocodiles. Um, so let's talk a little bit about how this process worked, and just kind of go from there and what their burial practices would have looked like. So let's start with an image, which may or may not be in your textbook. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head here, but it shows how the mummy of King Tut would have been actually laid to rest. So you'll notice a few things. You'll notice, for example, that the body here, right, is one part of many, right? That this is the actual mummified body, and you can see that it has a funerary mask on top, right? This mask is made mostly out of wood, gold, and lapis lazuli. Uh, so you can see that this would have been placed into one sarcophagus, right? And then they would have been placed inside another, inside another, inside another, right? Just kind of like a Russian nesting doll, if you know what those are, right? The little dolls that you take out and there's a smaller doll inside. That's how the Egyptian coffins looked, especially those of pharaohs, right? You can imagine all of the gold and resources devoted to creating this, right? Just for someone to be buried in, and essentially all that gold going to waste, right? So, in the middle layer, right? That's one that we might be a little bit more familiar with, right? It's a little bit more ornate, um, right? That actually is the second one down. That's actually the one that we're most familiar with in terms of imagery of King Tut's tomb. And then finally, there's a even bigger, mostly gold, a sarcophagus on top, right? So you can just imagine the importance here, right? And again, King Tut wasn't all that important to Egyptian society, right? People didn't really like him all that much. Um, and so, if this kind of ornateness, all of that gold and precious stones are used for a pharaoh that no one really cared about too much, imagine what it would have been for someone like Ramses the Great, or someone, one of the Amenhoteps and Thutmose's, that we talked about during the New Kingdom, right? This would have been absolutely ornate, full of gold and precious stones. So we know, just again from the archaeological evidence, that the Egyptian afterlife was based on bodies. So that's why they were mummified, right? It was important to preserve the body as best as they could, so that when the soul was reunited with the body, that things would be, as normal as possible, right? That everything would be functioning in a way that made sense. You wouldn't want to live for eternity with a decaying body, right? That doesn't sound fun. Might have been painful. So mummification became a really important tool to ensure that the person, thrived in the afterlife. That they were able to survive, uh, you know, and be successful. So they needed their bodies, right? They knew for the Egyptians that the afterlife was very much based like Earth. Again, that has to do with the regularity of the Nile River, providing them with consistency. So why would the afterlife be any different? So let's get into this process of mummification. So someone dies. They first empty out all of the internal organs and put them in jars. They did that for all of the organs except for two. One was the heart, which they typically left inside the body. Um, Remember from the last video that the Egyptians believed that the heart is where the soul resided. So they wanted to keep that close to the body so that the soul could return after its journey through the afterlife. The other organ they didn't put in was pretty notably the brain. People in the ancient world didn't know what the brain did. Right? It's not moving. There's nothing that really seems to be going on there. Right? You can't really look at someone's brain until they're dead. And even if you could, right, you don't see anything moving. There's nothing really happening in the brain. So the ancient Egyptians actually thought that that was just a cavity filled with mucus. So what they did, if you don't know this already, it's pretty gruesome. They would stick a hook up someone's nose and pull out the brain like piece by piece and scrape around in there and pull their brain out, thinking that that was just excess snot or something. Not knowing that what we know now, that the brain is the seat of the mind, and where we all of our bodily functions and thoughts are held and created. Um, right? So that's something that would make the Egyptian afterlife very interesting if you needed your bodies back, if they were all lacking brains. So once all the jars are labeled and set aside, then the real fun begins, which is that the body is then filled with linen and salt, right? That's a drying powder. It's a type of salt that they had. And the body would have actually been covered in salt as well. It would have been entirely encased in salt for something like 40 days. This is a process to completely dry out the body, right? They knew that moisture was bad. So they needed to make sure that they did things that would keep moisture away. Salt is used all over the world, right? It was known as a drying agent in the ancient world, and was used as a preservative, right? People would salt their meat to prevent it from going bad before refrigeration. So they applied the same principles to the human body. They just did such an amazing job of drying out the body that it remained preserved for thousands of years. And that's why ultimately the body is wrapped in linen. They would pour a resin, this kind of like sticky substance, like a glue almost, over the body, and then wrap it in linen. Linen is a fabric. It's, if you don't know, again, it's like a thicker cotton, if you will. If you're looking for household items that are made of linen, you're probably looking at like tablecloths or like thick curtains of some kind. Those are usually at least traditionally made from linen. Linen is actually a plant-based fabric. It's like a cotton. It's made from flax seed. If you've ever heard of flaxseed or flaxseed oil, um, right? That is actually where linen comes from. And the Egyptians had an abundance of flax, so they had an abundance of linen, right? They would cultivate this and grow it so that it would, they would have it for things like mummification and clothing. So that linen becomes really important. It's not just decorative, right? It's actually meant to keep the moisture away from the skin. That's why the body is wrapped like it is, like we all know the mummies to be. And especially at first, this process would take a really long time, right? This would take months, 2 to 3 months on average, and it usually cost a lot of money. You can imagine you're devoting a priest, right? This is usually a priest to Anubis. This is their full-time job, right? For months on end, preparing a body for mummification. This is not something that is done lightly. So at first, in the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdoms, in the beginning, really up until towards the end of maybe even after the New Kingdom, um, Egyptians this mummification was only preserved for royalty. Whether that's the nobility or the pharaoh himself got mummified, which lets you think about the chances of someone an average person making it to the afterlife, right? If you need your bodies, what's happening to all those people who are just decaying in the dirt? Um, but that's a thought for a different time. Here we have the pharaohs, right? Originally, this was a practice reserved for them, that they were the only ones who could really afford this and the cost associated. But over time, just like all technology, right? At the end of the day, this is a type of technology. At the end of the day, technology becomes cheaper over time. So by the end of the Egyptian civilization, you really see average everyday people being able to afford mummification. In fact, the Book of the Dead excerpt that we looked at was for a scribe, right? That not a particularly famous or important person, but just an average you know worker essentially was able to afford. Certainly upper middle class or upper class worker, but they were able to afford something like mummification. And even beyond that, they would mummify their pets, as I said before, right? If once this becomes a more affordable option, right, they would mummify the pets. Now, who knows if the Egyptians believe that the pets went into the afterlife, as we do, right? Certainly, all dogs go to heaven, but we're not sure what they said about the pets. My sense is that they didn't, but they still mummified them, right? Just like people would mummify or what we call taxidermy pets today, right? Or cremate a pet and keep their remains, right? They'd be loved members of the family, and so some were mummified to preserve their bodies out of affection, out of care. So that's really the process of mummification. Um, it's a really technical procedure, right? It mimics more of like a modern day surgery. They would have had great knowledge of anatomy by doing this process, and really of science by understanding how all this works. Um, so let's wrap up our notes here with Egyptian culture by talking about hieroglyphics, right? How we know so much about all of this stuff in ancient Egypt is through their writing. A lot of it is through archaeology, right? Through the artifacts, but there's even more to be learned through hieroglyphics and understanding what that means. Hieroglyphics really just means it's a type of writing that uses imagery. And the word itself actually comes from the Greek meaning holy image, right? So this is an image based writing system, and unlike what you might expect, that oh, there's a bird there, so therefore they must be talking about a bird, right? Actually, hieroglyphics are more phonemic, meaning that they're related to sounds, so that the bird image is meant to evoke a certain sound that you would make as you read it. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics usually didn't have vowels. Remember this. If all language, this is a quick aside here, but if you realize that all language starts as spoken, that really all languages is a series of sounds that we assign meaning to. So writing sounds down translates between different cultures differently, which is why, for example, the Spanish alphabet is slightly different than the English alphabet, right? It's mostly the same, but there are certain letters that exist in Spanish that don't exist in English, and vice versa. So here, right, that's just because there are different sounds that are made in those languages. So therefore, the alphabet has to adapt to those sounds. The same is true in ancient Egypt, right? That the hieroglyphics would represent sounds that would be made, and the hieroglyphics correspond to those sounds, which is why you might see, for example, on that alphabet chart, uh, similar, C and S and X all have that curvy line there, right? Well, they all kind of make a similar sound, right? They all can make a sound that sounds the same. So therefore, from our perspective, from a Latin alphabet perspective, right, we have to use that symbol multiple times. Something else to talk about with hieroglyphics is this hieroglyph that's in a circle here is an important hieroglyphic. Um, it's uh, it's meant to symbolize something, and to show you what that is, because not all hieroglyphs are kind of covered in a circle. So forgive me as I go back. So if we go back to this from an earlier video, right, you can actually see that there's a ton of hieroglyphics here, but none of them are in circles, right? They're in columns, right? That's actually how the Egyptians read hieroglyphics was vertically, right? If again, right, columns of hieroglyphics, nothing really in a circle there. But if we go back to the Akhenaten photos, right here, we actually do see some hieroglyphics within this oval or a circle, right? That appears a few times on this image. So that obviously must mean something, right? There must be extra meaning to hieroglyphics that are found in a circle. And I want to ask you just internally to maybe pause the video to think about what that means. So I'm going to ask you to pause now to think about what the hieroglyphics could mean that are in a circle. So hieroglyphics that are in a circle have a specific name. They're called a cartouche, which is spelled Cartouche, car, touch, e, cartouche. And a cartouche is an Egyptian name. Right? This is how we can identify a name from another type of word or phrase. So, for example, you'll remember that Akhenaten, when he changed his name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, Akhenaten means he who worships Aten. Okay, that's great. Makes sense as a name, right? He's identifying himself as that. But you could also see it being confusing to a reader if it's just clearly ends up start talking about he who worships Aten, right? That could be anybody who worships Aten, right? But the phrase would be Akhenaten, he who worships Aten. That's how it would be read. So how do you distinguish between anyone who worships Aten and the man, the pharaoh, Akhenaten? Well, you put those hieroglyphics in a circle. You encircle them in a cartouche, which then signifies to the reader that this is a name, that this is a person's name. And we actually know the hieroglyphics on the screen. If those of you that have been trying to figure it out using the alphabet, you might have trouble figuring out how it's read. So first, bottom to top. So here, even though my image is there, is blocking this, right? You have some images here that should be somewhat familiar. You have a hook. You have what looks like a whip, right? And you have what maybe looks like a throne or something like that. This is the symbol for Pharaoh, right? This is the symbol for Pharaoh. Remember, we've talked a lot about the crook and the flail, right? The symbols of Egyptian power. And then the image in the middle is meant to represent the double crown, right, that the pharaohs would wear. So you have, first off, starting at the bottom, that this is a pharaoh. We also see the Ankh, right? We've talked about that before, the Egyptian symbol of life, right? Which is an Ankh. You'll notice that that's not in the alphabet, right? Because this was meant to be said Ankh, right? It's meant to say the word Ankh. So here we actually have the name Tut Ankh Amun. King Tut. This is King Tut's cartouche. You now know how to read hieroglyphics. How cool is that? So notice that it's not always phonetic, right? This is not always right. That the Ankh is its own thing. So translating it hieroglyphics to letters is a little bit tricky, right? Sometimes we need clues to help us fill in the gaps, right? That might be lacking. And I'm going to post another video for you to watch probably on Friday or at some other time in the future, where it goes into how hieroglyphics were deciphered and a little more detail about how to actually read them, which I think you guys will find interesting. Finally, how do we know what any of this stuff is? Right? You can imagine that this is a language that was written 5,000 years ago. How can we possibly know what this is? Well, we're able to read it because of this thing. This is the Rosetta Stone. This is the item that the language learning software took their name from. This is important because this is what allowed us to understand Egyptian hieroglyphics. It doesn't look like much, but when you realize what's on here, you'll realize that there's a major value to this stone. So here's the story. In the town of Rosetta in Egypt, they were excavating in the 1700s, so not that long ago. And they came across this stone. And on the stone were clearly written 3 different languages. One was Egyptian hieroglyphics. That makes sense. If we're going to understand Egyptian hieroglyphics, it probably has hieroglyphics on it. But also on this was ancient Greek, right? This was during the time when the Greeks ruled Egypt. So ancient Greek is on this stone. And finally, which doesn't tell, those two things alone don't tell us much, but the third language is really important. This is called Demotic, Demotic, not demonic, Demotic. And Demotic was the average everyday writing style of the Egyptians. Right? You can imagine being a scribe in ancient Egypt, right? It would take forever if you had to draw the bird every time you had to make a certain sound, right? Or draw, whatever else, what other images were on there, a lion or a snake, right? It would take a really long time to get that right if you're a scribe trying to write things down quickly. So hieroglyphics were only used for monumental writing, right? Whether that's religious ceremonies or pharaohs, although that's also a religious ceremony, right? Statues, those kinds of things have hieroglyphics. But the average everyday writing in papyrus would have been done in this Demotic script. And luckily for us, we can read Demotic script. We know how to read Demotic script because it's very similar to other ancient Middle Eastern languages, and therefore we're able to read it. We also can read ancient Greek. And what they found was that when they started reading this together, the handful of people that could read both ancient Greek and Demotic realized that this is the same story. It's the story about Ptolemy V and some building project that he created, I think. Um, well, they made a really quick realization that if you have the story in Demotic and then the same exact story in ancient Greek, and chances are it's probably that story again in hieroglyphics. And it turns out that it is, that they were able to use those two languages to code break the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And that this stone, right, and you can see it's chipped, the stories are missing, right? You can imagine how difficult it would be to parse, the three different languages together. But this is what allowed us to read all of Egyptian hieroglyphics. And again, this was only done in the 1700s. So for all of that time in ancient Egypt, people didn't know, even Egyptians themselves didn't know how to read hieroglyphics, right? Because the civilization fell. So over time, the knowledge of hieroglyphics fell with it, and it was lost. It was lost to history. So just imagine all these artifacts, right, in ancient Egypt. Everything that we've seen in this class so far in Egypt has had hieroglyphics on it. Imagine not being able to read any of it, right? That right at your fingertips, but being so mysterious. Here, uh, I actually think it was the 1800s, early 1800s. The hieroglyphics were deciphered by a name, and you need to know this name. This is an important name in history for this reason. It was a Frenchman named Jean Champollion. Uh, Jean is his first name, and he's a guy. It's not Jean, it's Jean. He's French. So Jean is his first name, and the second name is Champollion. 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 Yeah, that sounds right. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure Google will autocorrect it for you anyway. But he was the one who made this discovery, who made this decipherment of the Egyptian hieroglyphics. So his name is very important to historians as this really great, person in history that opened up, this whole world of the Egyptian society to us. And he did that by using the Rosetta Stone. So that's it for our notes on Egypt. We're done Egyptian culture now. Please, any questions that you've had as you watch this, I'm hoping that you wrote them down so that we can talk a little bit in class before our test. And if you guys have any questions in the meantime that you're just dying to know, shoot me an email or a Schoology message, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So I will see you guys next time whenever I see you.